Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to getting well informed. We've got some really interesting material you sent in digging into cybersecurity, specifically two concepts that are just, well, crucial for understanding how systems get compromised.
Right. We're talking about arbitrary code execution and privilege escalation.
Exactly. They sound super technical, and okay, they are technical, but they're basically the keys to the kingdom for attackers. They have huge real-world consequences for, data, businesses, pretty much everyone.
That's a good way to put it. You can think of digital security like layers of an onion, maybe, or just layers of defense. Attackers are always poking, trying to find ways through.
Peeling back the layers.
Yeah, exactly. And getting the ability to run their own code, arbitrary code, and then boosting their permissions once they're inside privilege escalation. Those are two of the most powerful ways they get past those outer layers.
So our mission today is to unpack these ideas, right? Pull out the really important stuff, the surprising bits maybe from the material, and help you understand why this all matters so much.
Precisely. It's all about understanding the attacker's playbook.
Okay, let's do it. But before we dive in, just want to mention that this deep dive is sponsored by Stonefly. They're a leader in enterprise storage, backup and disaster recovery, AI storage, and cloud solutions.
And if you're looking for secure, ransomware-proof storage, which, let's face it, is pretty critical these days.
Definitely. Stonefly sells air-gapped and immutable storage solutions. You can contact them at sales@stonefly.com to schedule a demo. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Arbitrary code execution, ACE, layman's terms.
Okay, so at its core, arbitrary code execution, or ACE, it just means an attacker finds a way to make a target computer or a program run code that the attacker wrote.
Not the code it was supposed to run.
Exactly. Code of the attacker's choice.
Right. That sounds immediately very powerful, like game over territory.
It often is, or at least a major step towards it.
Yep.
It's not just making something glitch or crash. It's making the system actively do something malicious that the attacker wants.
Like what?
Well, it grants unauthorized access, obviously. It lets them perform actions the original software designers never, ever intended. Think about someone suddenly being able to run their commands on your computer.
Yeah, okay. So stealing data, wrecking things.
Pretty much anything they can program their malicious code to do. Once they have ACE, they can execute commands directly on that host system, often with the privileges of whatever process they compromised.
Which could be significant.
Could be. This is how they install malware that sticks around, persistence. Or create backdoors so they can get back in later easily. Or just gain that deep, lasting foothold inside a sensitive network. It's a critical goal for them.
How do they actually do it, though? I mean, you can't just email Notepad some code and expect it to run, right? How did they trick the software?
Right, you can't just ask nicely. They trick it by exploiting vulnerabilities, basically bugs or weaknesses in the software or the system configuration. Software is complex, thousands, millions of lines of code. Sometimes it's written in a way that doesn't perfectly handle unexpected input or unusual situations. Common flaws they look for are things like issues with input validation.
Meaning the software doesn't check what you're feeding it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Or it doesn't check thoroughly enough. Or things like buffer overflows, which we can get into. Or maybe just system misconfigurations that leave a door open.
Input validation seems like a big one. If a program expects a number, but you give it code.
That's the kind of thinking. The attacker crafts some kind of malicious input. Could be data. Could be a command disguised as data. The target software gets this input, and because it fails to handle it correctly, maybe doesn't check the length or the type or doesn't sanitize it properly, it gets, well, confused.
Confused how?
It can force the application to go down code paths it wasn't supposed to, or maybe even directly execute commands that were hidden inside that malicious input. Essentially, the attacker tricks the program into losing control of what code runs next.
The material mentioned memory manipulation being key here. That sounds pretty low level.
It often is. It's a fundamental way many ACE exploits work. You think of a program's memory like its short-term workspace. It uses different areas for different things, temporary variables on the stack, more dynamic data on the heap.
Okay.
Vulnerabilities like stack overflows, heap overflows, or something called use after free allow an attacker to mess with this workspace.
Mess with it how? Like write stuff where they shouldn't.
Exactly. In a classic Stack Overflow, for instance, the program tries to put too much data into a small buffer on the stack. The extra data spills over and overwrites whatever was next to it in memory.
And what's next to it?
Critically, it might be the return address, the instruction telling the program where to go back to after finishing a function. Or could be other important control data, like function pointers.
Ah, so if they overwrite that return address.
They can overwrite it with the address of their own malicious code, which they've also managed to place in memory somewhere. So when the function finishes, instead of going back to the normal program flow, bang, it jumps straight to the attacker's code.
Wow. So they're literally hijacking the program's internal validation system.
That's a great analogy. They're redirecting the execution flow. Use after free is conceptually similar. The program tries to use memory after it has supposedly finished with it and freed it. If an attacker can quickly grab that freed memory and put their own stuff there, the original program might then mistakenly use the attacker's malicious data as if it were legitimate.
Okay, that's complex, but I get the principle. They're corrupting the program's internal state to make it run their code. So ACE is running unauthorized code, often via memory tricks after finding a bug. Now, what about RCE? Remote code execution. I hear that term all the time. Is it the same?
Good question. It's related, but not exactly the same. RCE is actually a subset of ACU.
A subset. Okay, so all RCD is ACE, but not all ACE is RCE.
Precisely. ACE is the big umbrella term. Any unauthorized code execution. The distinction with RCE is purely about where the attack comes from.
Ah, the remote part.
Right. RCE means the attacker executes their code from a remote location, usually over a network like the internet. They don't need prior access to the machine. They exploit a vulnerability in a service that's listening for remote connections.
Like a web server vulnerability or email server.
Exactly. Something exposed to the outside world. ACE, on the other hand, covers any unauthorized code execution. It could be remote, which would make it RCE, but it could also be local.
Local, like I'm already logged into the machine.
Yes. Maybe you're a standard user and you exploit a bug in a program you're running locally to get it to execute code it shouldn't. Or maybe malware you accidentally downloaded runs and then uses a local exploit. That's ACE, but it's not RCE because the initial trigger wasn't remote.
Okay, so if I exploit a bug in Microsoft Word on my own laptop to run malicious code, that's ACE. If a hacker across the globe exploits a flaw in my company's web server to run their code, that's RCE and also ACE.
You got it. RCE needs that remote exploitability. ACE vulnerabilities can lurk anywhere that processes untrusted data, whether that data comes from the network, a USB drive, a file, whatever.
Why does this distinction matter for, say, defense?
Because you need to protect against both vectors. If you only worry about firewalls and network-facing stuff, RCE, you might miss a vulnerability that lets an insider or malware that's already gotten inside achieve ACE locally and then escalate privileges. You need defense in depth, covering both remote and local threats.
Makes sense. Layered security again. So let's talk more about how ACE happens. What are the common types of vulnerabilities that attackers use? The material highlighted a few key ones.
Yes, some recurring themes. One big one is deserialization vulnerabilities.
Deserialization. Okay, what is that exactly?
So imagine you have complex data in your program, like an object with lots of settings. To save it to a file or send it over the network, the program often flattens it into a simple stream of bytes. That's serialization.
Like packing it flat for shipping.
Good analogy. Deserialization is the unpacking process on the other end, taking that stream of bytes and rebuilding the original live object in memory.
And the vulnerability is in the unpacking.
Exactly. If the application unpacks or deserializes this data insecurely, maybe it trusts the incoming data too much and doesn't validate it properly, an attacker can craft a malicious stream of bytes.
To do what? What's in the malicious stream?
They can embed instructions or structures within that serialized data. When the vulnerable application tries to deserialize it, it can be tricked into not just rebuilding the expected object, but also executing arbitrary code that the attacker cleverly hid inside.
Wow, so the data itself carries the weapon. Where do you see these vulnerabilities?
They pop up in many languages and frameworks, especially anywhere an application accepts serialized objects from potentially untrusted sources. Think about web apps communicating or saving complex state.
How do you stop that? Seems tricky.
You have to be extremely paranoid about any serialized data coming in. Implement strict type checking. Make absolutely sure the object being rebuilt is the exact type you expect and nothing else. Use secure, up-to-date deserialization libraries that have built-in protections. And ideally, avoid deserializing data from untrusted sources altogether if you can. Again, secure coding and validation are key.
Okay, treat serialized data as hostile. You also mentioned memory safety issues earlier, buffer overflows and the like.
Right, the classics. Buffer overflows, use after free, double free errors. These all stem from the program mishandling how it uses memory. writing too much data, using memory it shouldn't, freeing things incorrectly.
And we talked about how that lets attackers overwrite return addresses or other critical data.
Exactly. By exploiting these memory errors, attackers can corrupt the program's internal state, change pointers, hijack the control flow, and ultimately divert execution to their own malicious code.
What's the defense against these memory bugs?
The best defense is using memory-safe programming languages, where possible languages like Java, Python, C#, Rust, where the language itself manages memory automatically and prevents many of these errors by design.
But lots of important software is still written in languages like C and C++.
True, for those languages, developers need to be incredibly careful. Use safe coding practices, employ tools that check for memory errors, use modern compiler defenses like bounds checking, stack canaries, which are like little tripwires in memory, to detect overflows and address space layout randomization, ASLR, which makes it harder for attackers to predict where things are in memory.
So better languages or very careful coding and protective tools. What was the third vulnerability type? Type confusion.
Type confusion. This happens when a program, due to a flaw, gets confused about what type of data it's working with. It might treat a number as if it's a memory address, or an object of one kind as if it's a completely different kind.
Like mistaking apples for oranges, but with code.
Sort of. Imagine the code expects data representing, say, user profile information, but due to a bug, it mistakenly interprets that same chunk of memory as if it contains instructions for network communication. This can lead to really unexpected behavior, potentially accessing memory it shouldn't, or calling functions improperly.
And attackers can turn that confusion into code execution.
Yes, if they can carefully craft the input data and understand exactly how the type confusion affects memory layout and program flow, they might be able to arrange things so that the confused program ends up reading data they control as if it were executable code, or jumping to a location they specify. It's often complex to exploit.
Prevention sounds like discipline again.
Absolutely. Strict type checking during development is crucial. Modern languages often provide better type safety. Thorough code reviews, both manual and automated with static analysis tools, can help catch potential type confusion bugs before they become vulnerabilities. Runtime checks can also sometimes detect these issues.
Okay, so deserialization flaws, memory safety bugs, type confusion. These are major ways attackers achieve ACE. It helps to see how these play out in the real world. The material listed some pretty big recent examples.
Definitely. These aren't theoretical. Log4j CVE 2021-44832, that was a huge one.
Oh yeah, log4 shell, that caused chaos. What was the ACE mechanism there?
Log4j is a super common logging tool for Java apps. The vulnerability, nicknamed log4 shell, was in how it handled certain lookups within log messages. An attacker could send data to an application, maybe in a web request header or username field, anything that might get logged containing a specially crafted string.
Just a string in the logs.
Yeah. Log4j would process this string, and a feature designed for substitutions could be abused to make Log4j reach out to a remote server controlled by the attacker, often using LDOP, download malicious Java code, and execute it right there on the server running the application.
Just by logging something, that's really bad. The reach must have been enormous.
It was terrifyingly widespread. Massive panic patching ensued. Another big one in the Java world was Spring 4 shell, CVE 2022-22965.
Affecting the Spring framework, right? Another foundational piece of software.
Exactly. Different mechanism, but similar outcome. RCE. Attackers could send specially crafted HTTP requests to web applications built using vulnerable versions of the Spring framework. This could allow them to bypass security checks and ultimately execute arbitrary code on the underlying server. Again, urgent patching needed.
It really shows how flaws in these core libraries or frameworks are so dangerous. What about things we use every day, like browsers?
Oh, constantly. Browsers are incredibly complex beasts, processing untrusted web content all day long. Google Chrome, for example, frequently patches ACE vulnerabilities. CVE 2023-585 was mentioned. These flaws could allow a malicious website to run code inside the browser's sandbox.
And if they escape the sandbox?
That's the next step, potentially. Which is why keeping your browser updated is so important. Google and other vendors are constantly finding and fixing these things. You just need to let the updates install.
Good reminder. Don't ignore those update prompts. What about PDFs?
The Adobe Acrobat and Reader are perennial targets too. The material mentioned is zero-day CVE 2023-26369 that was exploited in early 2023. Attackers use malicious PDF documents. Just opening the booby-trapped PDF could trigger the vulnerability and execute code on the victim's computer.
It's just opening a file.
Yeah. Again, the advice is standard but crucial. Keep Adobe Reader updated, and be incredibly suspicious of PDF attachments you weren't expecting.
Seems like almost anything that processes external files or data is fair game. Microsoft and Apple deal with this too, right?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
all the time. Microsoft patched ACE 0 days, affecting the Edge browser in Microsoft Teams. CVE 2023-4863 and CVE 2023-5217 were mentioned. Malicious web content or even crafted messages could trigger code execution, running with the permissions of the logged-in user.
Which could be bad if that user has lots of rights.
Very bad. Apple also issued patches for 0 days, affecting iOS, macOS, and Safari. CVE 2023-42824 was one, related to processing web content. Again, the potential outcome was ACE, possibly leading to full device compromise if exploited successfully. Vendor patches are the key defense here. Apply them quickly.
So the takeaway is ACE vulnerabilities are everywhere, constantly being found and fixed, hopefully, and actively exploited by attackers. Once they achieve ACE, what's the next logical step for them?
Often it's to gain more power. Which brings us neatly to the second major concept, privilege escalation.
Right, climbing the ladder.
Exactly. Privilege escalation is the act of exploiting a bug, design flaw, or configuration oversight in an operating system or software application to gain elevated access to resources that are normally protected from an application or user.
So you start with limited access and try to get more. Is this always malicious?
No, actually. The material makes a point that legitimate privilege escalation happens all the time. Think about when you right-click and choose Run as Administrator in Windows to install software. That's temporary controlled privilege escalation.
Ah, okay. But attackers use it for nefarious purposes.
Absolutely. It's one of the most common things attackers do after they get that initial foothold, maybe via ACE or stolen credentials. Their goal is often to get to sensitive data or gain control of critical systems, maybe to deploy ransomware widely, which usually requires higher privileges.
So it's how they go from being a nobody on the system to being the boss.
Pretty much. From the attacker's viewpoint, it's the art of increasing privileges. They start low, maybe as a standard user on one machine, or just the permissions of a compromised web application, and they work their way up.
Up to what? What's the ultimate goal?
The ultimate goal locally might be the system account on Windows, which has the highest privileges on that machine. The network-level goal is often domain administrator. If they get domain admin credentials, they essentially own the entire Windows network. Game over.
Okay. The material breaks privilege escalation down into two main types, vertical and horizontal.
That's right. Two different directions an attacker can move to gain more access. Vertical privilege escalation, sometimes called privilege elevation, is probably what most people think of first.
Going up.
Exactly. It's when a user or application with lower privileges manages to get access to functions or data reserved for higher privilege users or applications on that same system.
So my standard user account somehow tricks Windows into giving it administrator rights on my own PC.
That's the idea. An attacker compromises, say, a regular user account on a server. Then they exploit a vulnerability or misconfiguration on that same server to elevate the privileges of that specific compromised account, maybe adding it to the local administrators group, for instance. You're increasing the power of the identity you already have.
Okay, that's vertical. What about horizontal?
Horizontal privilege escalation is different. Technically, it means a normal user gaining access to functions or content reserved for other normal users. But in the attack context, it usually means something slightly different.
How so?
It often means an attacker, having compromised one account, say user A with standard privileges, finds a way to access the resources or credentials of another account. Say user B, who happens to be an administrator or has access to different systems. They aren't elevating user A's privileges, they're effectively becoming user B.
So they're not climbing the ladder with their current account, they're stealing the key to someone else's ladder, which is already higher up.
Exactly. They might use their initial foothold to scan the network, find stored credentials for an admin account, maybe jump password hashes from memory. Then they use those stolen admin credentials to log into other systems or access data with higher privileges. They've moved laterally to a more powerful context.
The material mentioned an analogy, internet banking user A somehow getting into user B's account.
Right. It's accessing someone else's context at potentially the same or a higher level rather than elevating your own. The material also notes that horizontal escalation is very common and often relies on finding credentials or exploiting trust relationships between systems.
Okay, vertical is up, horizontal is sideways to potentially higher ground. To really understand how attackers exploit Windows for this, the material suggests looking at how Windows intends privileges to work first.
Yeah, understanding the legitimate structure helps you see where the weaknesses are. Privileged accounts are fundamental to Windows IT. You need admins to manage systems, configure things, install software. Users need permissions to access their data and run applications.
And there's a clear distinction between standard users and privileged accounts.
Supposedly, standard accounts are for everyday tasks with limited rights. Privileged accounts have broader administrative or specialized access. These can be tied to human admins or non-human things like service accounts that run background processes.
What kinds of tasks typically require these elevated privileges in Windows?
Oh, lots. Configuring system settings, installing or removing software, creating or modifying other user accounts, managing backups, patching the OS, remotely logging into servers, accessing certain sensitive system files or registry keys, all require specific privileges.
And how are these privileges assigned? Through accounts and groups.
Primarily, yes. Windows grants permissions to user accounts, or more commonly, to groups. You put a user account into a group, like administrators, backup operators, remote desktop users, and they inherit the privileges associated with that group. These can be local to one machine or apply across an entire domain.
The material mentioned a common pitfall here.
Yes, the issue of overprivileging users, especially giving standard users local administrator rights on their own workstations. It often happens because it seems easier than figuring out granular permissions, but it means if that user's account is compromised, the attacker starts with admin rights on that machine, which is a huge advantage for them.
A big head start for escalation. Where does Windows actually keep track of all this account and password information locally?
In a database file called the Security Account Manager, or SAM file, it stores the local user accounts and, importantly, hashes of their passwords. When you log in, Windows verifies your credentials against the SAM, or against a domain controller for domain accounts, and then issues you an access token.
An access token, like a temporary ID badge.
Exactly like that. It contains your user identity, your SID, the groups you belong to, their SIDs, and the specific privileges you hold. Whenever you try to access a resource, Windows checks your token to see if you have permission.
What about that pop-up, the user account control UAC prompt?
UAC is another layer. Even if your account is in the administrators group, most of the time Windows runs your programs with standard user privileges. When an action requires true administrator rights, UAC pops up asking for confirmation or credentials. It's meant to prevent accidental changes and make malware less effective if it runs under a standard user context initially.
So privileges are tied to users and groups via tokens. Are there permissions on individual things too, like files?
Yes, absolutely. Windows uses access control list, or ACLs, on objects like files, folders, registry keys, printers, services. An ACL specifies which users or groups, identified by their SIDs, have what kind of access, read, write, execute, delete, etc., to that specific object. These permissions can be very granular and can be inherited from parent objects.
And SIDs are the internal IDs for everything.
Right. Security identifiers. Windows uses these unique strings internally to keep track of users, groups, computers, etc., rather than relying on names which can change. Your access token is full of SIDs representing you and your groups.
Okay, so Windows has this quite complex, layered system. Accounts, groups, SIDs, tokens, UAC, ACLs. It's designed for control, but that complexity itself seems like it could be exploited.
That's exactly the point. This structure, the happy path, while designed for security and order, has inherent complexities, default settings, and potential misconfigurations that attackers specifically target. They look for the cracks in this structure to follow their unhappy path to privilege escalation.
Let's walk down that unhappy path then. An attacker has landed, maybe via ACE, maybe stolen creds, they have low privileges. What's their process for escalating?
It's usually systematic. Their first goal is to understand the environment they're in. This is the reconnaissance and enumeration phase.
Spying around, what are they looking for?
Everything. Who am I logged in as? What privileges does this account have? What operating system version is it? What patches are installed? What other users are on this system? What groups exist? What network connections are active? What services are running? What software is installed? Are there any saved credentials lying around?
They're building a map of the system and looking for weak spots.
Precisely. They're looking for those misconfigurations we talked about, known vulnerabilities in the OS or installed software, any users who have more privileges than they need, overprivileged users, and especially weak or stored passwords.
And they want to do this quietly, right?
Stealth is key. The longer they can enumerate and plan without tripping alarms, the better their chances. They specifically look for attack paths that security teams might not be monitoring closely or accounts that are poorly managed.
What are the high-value accounts they're ultimately aiming for?
The material gives them some colorful names. The king of accounts is the domain admin total control. Domain service accounts are challenging and scary because they often have wide network access. Local administrator accounts are sometimes forgotten with weak passwords. Emergency or break glass accounts might be help me, accounts left over privileged. Service accounts running applications can be hidden and forever with lots of rights. Application accounts might be elevated targets. And accounts with access to critical data, even without admin rights, are silent but deadly privileged data user accounts.
So lots of potential targets depending on their goal. Enumeration helps them find paths to these.
Yes, they use built-in Windows commands or specialized scripts to query users, groups, services, permissions, network shares. They're piecing together the puzzle to find the easiest or least detectable way to elevate.
Okay, they've done their homework, found some potential weaknesses. What are the specific techniques they use to exploit these and actually get higher privileges?
There are many, but some common ones focus on services. One is exploiting insecure service permissions.
How does that work?
Okay, so you have a Windows service configured to run with high privileges, maybe even as the system account. But due to a mistake, a standard user account has permission to modify the configuration of that service.
Uh-oh.
Right. Specifically, they might have permission to change the service's bin path, the path to the executable file that the service runs.
So the attacker just changes that path to point to their own malicious program.
Bingo. They change the bin path to their malware. The next time the service starts or restarts, Windows launches the attacker's executable, but it runs with the high privileges, like system, of the original service. Instant vertical escalation.
A simple permission mistake leads to system access.
Wow. What about unquoted service paths? That sounds almost like a typo being exploited.
It basically is. It's surprisingly common. Let's say a service executable is located at C program files some vendor service.exe. If the path in the service configuration doesn't have quotation marks around it, Windows can get confused by the spaces.
When it tries to find the executable, it might first look for cprogram.exe. If it doesn't find that, it might look for cprogramfilesofsum.exe. If an attacker has permission to write files in C or C program files, which sometimes happens, they can place their malicious executable there, naming it program.exe or sum.exe.
And the service runs the attacker's file instead of the real one.
Yes, because Windows finds the attacker's file first due to the missing quotes. And again, it runs with the high privileges of the service. A tiny syntax error leads to major compromise.
That's crazy. Are there other service-related tricks?
Similar ideas apply to weak registry permissions. Service configurations are often stored in the Windows registry. If an attacker finds the service's registry key and has permissions to modify it, they can change the executable path there, just like modifying the service properties directly.
And the most direct way.
If the service's actual executable file, service.exe in our example, has weak file permissions, allowing a standard user to overwrite or replace it, the attacker can just swap the legitimate file with their malware. Next time the service runs, it's the attacker's code executing with high privileges.
So poorly secured services are a goldmine for escalation. What about passwords? Still a major factor.
Huge. Absolutely huge. Despite all the fancy exploits, finding and using passwords is still a primary method. Attackers relentlessly search for passwords stored insecurely.
Where do people still leave passwords?
Clear text files on desktops or network shares,
Yeah.
hard-coded in scripts or application config files, saved in browser password managers, which might be accessible if the user account is compromised. The material stresses this is still incredibly common. Weak passwords, reused passwords, shared passwords all make the attacker's job easier.
How do they find them?
They use simple commands to search the entire file system or registry for keywords like password, credentials, etc. They also have tools to dump passwords stored by web browsers or other applications.
Basic, but effective if people aren't careful. And exploiting users with too many rights.
That's the overprivileged user problem again. That standard user who's given local admin rights just in case, or because it was easier. If an attacker compromises that account, they already start with admin rights on that machine.
Which gives them a platform to jump further.
Definitely. Local admin rights allow them to potentially dump credentials for other users, including domain admins, who log into that machine, using tools like Mimikatz. Or they can exploit other OS configuration weaknesses accessible only to admins. It's a critical stepping stone, and it's a widespread issue because of legacy IT practices.
So that convenience of giving local admin rights creates a massive risk. What about the SAM database you mentioned earlier? Can they get passwords from there?
They can try. Remember, the SAM stores password hashes, not plain text passwords. The live SAM file is locked by the OS. But attackers look for backups. Sometimes backups are made automatically and stored in places like the Windows Repair directory. See Windows Repair.
If they find a backup SAM file?
They also need the corresponding system registry Hive backup, because that contains the key needed to decrypt the SAM hashes. If they can get both files, they can use tools offline to extract the hashes for all local accounts.
And then crack the hashes.
Yes, using password cracking tools like Hashcat or John the Ripper. If users had weak passwords, the hashes can often be cracked relatively quickly, revealing the original password.
What if they can't crack the hash? Is it useless then?
Not necessarily. This is where pass the hash comes in. Many Windows authentication protocols don't actually need the plaintext password. They can work directly with the hash.
Seriously?
Yes. If an attacker obtains a user's NTLM password hash, even without cracking it, they can often use tools to present that hash directly to other machines on the network for authentication as that user. If that user's account has access to other machines, the attacker can move laterally or access resources using the hash alone.
Wow, so they don't even need the password, just its hashed version. That seems powerful. What about graphical applications? Can they be exploited for escalation?
Yes, even things that seem benign. The material had a great example with Razer mouse software. Just plugging in a Razer mouse could, through a vulnerability in the driver installation process, allow a standard user to gain system privileges by tricking a Windows update process using PowerShell.
Plugging in a mouse gives you system. That's wild.
It shows that vulnerabilities can be in unexpected places. Finally, there are direct OS vulnerabilities or kernel exploits.
Exploiting Windows itself.
Right. These are less common to find, but potentially devastating. An attacker might have low-level access and then use a newly discovered zero-day or unpatched vulnerability in the Windows kernel or a core system component to directly elevate their privileges to system. Print Nightmare, CVE 2021-34527, was a famous recent example that allowed both RCE and local privilege escalation to system via the print spooler service.
Okay, so attackers have this whole toolkit of techniques, and the material mentions they use specific tools to automate finding these weaknesses.
Absolutely. Doing all this enumeration and checking manually is slow and generates a lot of activity that might be detected. Automation makes them faster and potentially stealthier.
What kind of tools are we talking about?
Bloodhound is a really interesting one. It's used by both attackers and defenders. It maps out relationships in an Active Directory environment, who is in what group, who has admin rights where, which computers trust which others. It uses graph theory to visualize these complex connections.
To find hidden paths.
Exactly. It can reveal complex, non-obvious paths an attacker could take to escalate privileges from a low-level account all the way to domain admin just by following chains of permissions and group memberships.
That sounds incredibly useful for both sides. What else?
There's Windows Exploit Suggester Next Generation, or WES-NG. You feed it the output of the basic system info command from a Windows machine.
Which lists OS version patches.
Right. WES-NG compares that information against a database of known Microsoft vulnerabilities and tells you which ones the system is likely susceptible to, including privilege escalation flaws, and often points to publicly available exploit code.
A quick way to see known weaknesses.
Very quick. Then you have script collections. Windows privilege escalation. Awesome scripts. WinPs is popular.
WinPs. Heard of that one. What does it do?
It's a set of scripts that run on the target machine and automatically check for a huge list of common local privilege escalation vectors caused by misconfigurations, things like stored credentials, weak permissions on files or registry keys, insecure services, exploitable scheduled tasks, sensitive information in files, etc. It highlights potential findings for the attacker.
So it automates the enumeration and checking phase.
Yes, heavily. PowerUp is similar. It's a collection of PowerShell scripts designed to do the same thing. Find common Windows misconfigurations that lead to privilege escalation, often run with just one command like invoke all checks.
PowerShell makes it easy since it's already on Windows.
Exactly. And Seatbelt is another enumeration tool, written in C#. It performs a series of security-oriented safety checks on the host, gathering information that could be useful for finding escalation paths.
It really seems like these tools make privilege escalation much more accessible.
They significantly lower the bar and speed up the process. An attacker can compromise a machine and, within minutes, potentially identify multiple paths to elevate their privileges using these automated tools, making defense much harder.
Which brings us to the crucial part, defense. We know attackers have ACE and PE techniques, they have tools. How do we stop them, or at least make it much harder?
That's the million-dollar question. And the material starts with a really important mindset point. Aiming for perfect prevention is probably unrealistic and dangerous. It can lead to a false sense of security.
So we have to assume they might get in or might find a way to escalate.
It's safer to assume that, yes, the focus should be on risk reduction, making successful attacks significantly more difficult and costly for the attacker, and critically, on visibility, being able to detect and respond to attacks quickly when they do happen.
Harden the targets and watch them closely.
Exactly. If you harden your systems well, you force attackers to use more complex or noisier techniques. Those noisier techniques are more likely to trip your security alarms. Early detection is key to stopping an attack before it achieves its ultimate goal, like deploying ransomware or stealing massive amounts of data.
Okay, so what are the concrete defensive strategies?
It's a layered approach, touching on everything from code to configuration to user behavior. First principles, like we discussed, for ACE defense.
Right.
Rigorous input validation and sanitization. Clean and check everything coming into your application.
Secure coding practices?
Absolutely. Code auditing and reviews, both manual and automated, to catch vulnerabilities early, using secure, well-vetted libraries and frameworks instead of reinventing the wheel insecurely.
And the big one, patching.
Non-negotiable. Keep everything updated. Operating systems, applications, libraries, firmware. Regularly applying patches closes the known vulnerabilities that tools like WESNG will immediately flag. This shrinks the attacker's window of opportunity dramatically.
What about detecting exploits as they happen?
That's where runtime protection comes in. Security tools that monitor application behavior in real time can sometimes spot and block exploit attempts, even for unknown zero-day vulnerabilities, by recognizing malicious patterns of activity.
And managing those powerful privileged accounts.
This is critical for stopping privilege escalation. Secure password management is essential, ideally using enterprise password vaults or full privileged access management (PM) solutions.
How does PAME help specifically?
PM takes privileged credentials, like admin passwords, service account passwords, out of human hands or config files, and stores them securely. It can automatically rotate complex passwords for service accounts. Crucially, it enables just-in-time JIT access, granting elevated privileges only when needed for a limited time for a specific task, and then automatically revoking them. This eliminates the problem of standing privileges that attackers exploit.
And the principle of least privilege.
Fundamental. This is zero trust applied to permissions. Every user, every application, every service should have only the absolute minimum privileges required to do its job, no more. This means getting rid of those unnecessary local admin rights for standard users. It dramatically reduces the impact if an account is compromised.
Makes sense. Less power to steal. What about MFA?
Multi-factor authentication, but applied at depth, not just for logging into the network initially. Require MFA for accessing critical systems, for retrieving credentials from a PAM vault, or specifically when attempting actions that constitute privilege elevation. Make the attacker prove their identity again at critical points.
What else can be done?
Application control, or allow listing, deny listing, can prevent known malicious tools or unauthorized scripts from running. Auditing and logging are vital. Continuously monitor who is using privileged accounts, what they're doing, and when. Set up alerts for suspicious activity, like an account being added to an admin group, or failed login attempts. These logs are also crucial for investigating incidents later. And don't forget the basics. Secure your Wi-Fi with strong encryption, WPA3, and unique passwords. Back up your data regularly, securely, offsite or cloud, and test your restores. You need to know you can recover. Train your users relentlessly on phishing and social engineering awareness. Encrypt sensitive data wherever it lives, at rest and in transit.
It really is a comprehensive effort.
It has to be. Proactive cybersecurity posture means having clear policies, promoting awareness, having procedures for reporting incidents immediately. Use monitoring tools. Conduct regular security audits. Secure physical access to servers. Secure mobile devices used for work. Have an incident response plan ready and tested. Even consider the security of IoT devices on your network. They're often weak entry points.
So it's a mix of technology, process, and people working together.
Exactly. It's about using the tools correctly, enforcing policies like least privilege consistently, and building security awareness in everyone. It's collective defense.
To really drive home some of these points, especially about patching and the fact that even security tools aren't immune, the material provided a very recent example concerning the Tenable Nessus Agent.
Right, that's a perfect case study. The Nessus Agent is a piece of software installed on computers specifically to help find security vulnerabilities and check compliance. It reports back to a central Nessus management console.
So the tool designed to find security problems had security problems.
Ironically, yes. Tenable released an advisory, TNS 2025-11, detailing several high-severity vulnerabilities found in the Nessus Agent software for Windows, which were fixed in version 10.8.5.
High severity. What could an attacker do?
Several things, all leading to privilege escalation. CVE 2025-36631, CVSS 8.4, allowed a local, non-administrative user to overwrite arbitrary system files using the agent's logging mechanism running with system privileges.
Ouch. Overwriting system files as system is definitely bad.
Airy. CVE 2025-36632, CVSS 8.8, the highest, allowed a non-admin user to arbitrarily delete local system files with system privileges, which could also lead to privilege escalation or denial of service.
So basically, if you were a standard user on a machine with a vulnerable Nessus agent installed, you could potentially become system by exploiting the agent itself.
That was the risk. These flaws affected versions 10.8.4 and earlier. Tenable fixed them in 10.8.5 and advised customers to update promptly. Thankfully, they weren't aware of active exploitation in the wild at the time of the advisory.
How do these agents normally get updated? Is it automatic?
Often, yes. The agents typically connect back to a central Nessus manager or Tenable cloud platform and can auto-update from there. However, manual updates are also possible, especially for disconnected networks, by downloading the installer package and running an update command locally. Though the material notes you need administrator privileges to manually update the agent.
This whole example just hammers home that patching point, doesn't it? You have to patch everything, even the tools you rely on for security scanning.
Absolutely. It shows that vulnerabilities can exist anywhere, in any piece of software. Diligent patch management across the entire software estate is critical. It also highlighted some real-world complexity, as there was a brief period where earlier 10.8 Pinex updates caused issues for some users, require manual fixes, showing that even patching isn't always smooth sailing for defenders.
Right. Wow. Okay. We have covered a huge amount today. Started with arbitrary code execution, how attackers get their code running by exploiting flaws like deserialization, memory bugs, type confusion.
And distinguished ACE from the remote-only version, RCE.
We looked at major real-world examples like Log4j, Spring4Shell, and vulnerabilities patched in browsers, PDF readers, and operating systems from all the major vendors.
Then we pivoted to privilege escalation, the attacker's quest for more power, understanding the difference between climbing vertically and moving horizontally to gain access.
We reviewed the Windows privilege model and then saw how attackers pick it apart, exploiting misconfigured services, weak permissions, stolen passwords, the SAM database, using techniques like pass the hash.
And we saw how tools like Bloodhound, WESNG, WinPeas automate finding these weaknesses.
Finally, we spent a lot of time on defense, emphasizing risk reduction and visibility over perfect prevention, highlighting layered strategies, patching, least privilege, PAM, MFA, monitoring user training, and more.
And that Tenable agent example really underscored the universal need for patching, even your security tools. It's a continuous battle.
It definitely is. And just a reminder, this deep dive was sponsored by Stonefly, a leader in enterprise storage, backup and disaster recovery, AI storage, and cloud solutions. If you need secure, ransomware-proof storage, check out their air-gapped and immutable storage options. Contact sales at stonefly.com to schedule a demo.
So to wrap up, maybe a final thought to leave you with. We've talked a lot about exploiting bugs and misconfigurations in traditional software for privilege escalation. But looking ahead, with the rise of AI and machine learning systems being integrated into critical areas, systems that might themselves be granted significant trust and access. What happens if attackers find ways to manipulate or, as Material briefly touched on, jailbreak these AI systems?
Could they become a new vector for privilege escalation? Tricking an AI with trusted access into performing actions it shouldn't.
It's a fascinating and maybe slightly concerning question, isn't it? What new attack surfaces and escalation paths might emerge as AI becomes more embedded in our digital infrastructure? Something to think about as this landscape keeps evolving.
Definitely food for thought. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.